Hello, everybody, and welcome to our fourth installment of our virtual roundtable series by GlocalNet. Today, we have the honor of speaking with Ambassador Doug Holladay about his new book, Rethinking Success. Workwell research notes that 88% of Americans don't have a passion for their work. So a very timely book and a timely resource from Ambassador Doug Holladay, who comes as a senior advisor from Goldman Sachs. He's a professor at Georgetown University, currently the founder and CEO of Path North, and former special advisor to the White House and ambassador to South Africa. So his wisdom is unparalleled. So thank you for joining us today. And Pastor Bob Roberts are going to walk through 8 essential practices of finding meaning in work. And then next week, we have Pastor Kevin Cox talking about what a GlocalNet church is and how small churches can multiply. So whether you're a church planter, an elder, a pastor at an existing church, we have some practical tips of how to multiply, how to domain engagement, and how to serve your city well. So please join us next week for that. Don't forget, sign up for our newsletter at glocal.net. If you missed any of our previous episodes, they're online at glocal.net as well. Follow us on our social channels for all the resources that we're going to continue to provide to pastors, business leaders, and more. So thank you again for joining us. And here is Pastor Bob Roberts and Ambassador Doug Holladay.
Hi, I'm Bob Roberts with GlocalNet and back for another virtual roundtable. I am excited about this. No preachers this week. All right, great. No preachers. So the thing about GlocalNet, we say it's mobilizing the church in the public square. Why would we have preachers every week? I mean, I think too much we get into this preacher thing and we need to back away from it. It's the people in the church that are the heroes, guys, not us guys who stand up and preach. Our job is to make them the heroes. And I've got somebody who's one of my heroes today, who's made a lot of heroes out of a lot of people. And so I hope, pastors, that you have men and women that are business leaders, educational leaders, all kind of leaders that are listening today. He's a friend of mine. His name's Doug Holladay. He wrote the most incredible book. I'm going to hold it up where you can see it. Rethinking Success. It's incredible. I had to read it really slow. I marked it up really good. I've got all kind of stuff. And we're just going to have a free-flowing conversation today. He reminds me of somebody who had a huge impact on my life, a man named Bob Buford. Bob was a businessman. Bob really was not a businessman. Bob was more of a Renaissance man who studied and thought, and because he could think about a lot of different things, he could do business and a lot of other things. Yeah. Doug's in that same category. And I want you to listen to some of the quotes out of this. Just the back cover throughout the book. Here are 4 quotes. Listen to these quotes. How to succeed without losing your soul. Hugely successful, but we're failing at life. Listen to this one. Our point of identity with others is not our polished image, accomplishments, but rather our broken parts and dark sides. Ambassador Holladay, there's no one who's been more successful than you. I mean, you've worked with President Reagan and the White House. You know presidents. You started a Wall Street company. You were with Goldman Sachs. I mean, you've done it all, man. I even discovered you went to Princeton Seminary. What was that about? I didn't know. Were you thinking about being a preacher or what? I just saw that in the bio. What is that about? I mean, you've been closer to more leaders than most people in the world. You've been hugely successful. And yet all these things about getting in touch with realizing our brokenness. Have you been there? Have you ever faced brokenness? I mean, I look at a guy like you. How could you ever fail? Have you faced that?
You know, it's funny, Bob, thank you for the privilege of having a conversation with you. You're one of my heroes. I love what you've done with your life. But, you know, I've always felt like I've never been qualified for anything. And I truly mean that. It's kind of like you know, it's like the Hamilton musical. It says, I just want to be in the room. I just kind of show up a lot of time. And as Woody Allen said, most of life is showing up. And I'm imaginative and I can figure stuff out. But should I have been in any of these places? Absolutely no. So I feel like it's kind of like what Churchill said about Lord Adley one time. He's trying to think of something positive to say. He said he's a humble man, and for a good reason. And I feel like I'm a humble man, and there's a real reason for it. So I feel like I've never felt. I feel like the only reason I'm in the room is because God wants me there. And I feel like I am creative, I'm imaginative, I see things differently, but I don't have the, the depth that some have and everything. I feel like I know how to connect dots pretty good, and that's my strength. But I feel like humility should characterize us all when we're honest about how our dark side, how it just is always there. I feel like it's a battle to really walk in the light.
I like the way you say that, because we get the idea we're going to grow up, overcome everything, and we're just going to be perfect people and great people.
Yeah,
exactly. I think God uses us in our brokenness all throughout.
Absolutely.
Absolutely. I loved on page 16, it cracked me up when I was reading. You were hosting Mother Teresa at the White House. And your question, so what's it like to be Mother Teresa? God, that's the kind of question I would ask that would get me in a lot of trouble.
I know you would, Bob.
I just died laughing at that question. I mean, did she look stunned when she?
First she's a diminutive little woman, and I remember she comes out into the Rose Garden, and in Reagan, in his perfect way, all that he did was say Mother Teresa and got out of the way. So she broke into prayer there. She just was praying for the media. You had all these Sam Donaldson, all these people, the Secretary of State. And after it was over, I saw her, and she was in front of the West Wing, and I thought there was a medical incident. There's a crowd gathered around, and I went up and looked. There's this woman about 4'10" passing out tracts to people, the press and everything. Then she comes back to my office. And I asked her that question, Bob. I don't know what to ask Mother Teresa, but I said, you are Mother Teresa. We all talk about, we joke about people being mother. You're the real thing. What is it like? So I was really taken back when and then this is way before that priest talked about her dark nights of the soul and how she struggled with belief. But when she said, I know that I'm capable of any sin. And I'm like, really? You're really Mother Teresa? But I realized that the people that are really honest about their journey with Jesus and God, they see the brokenness in their life, and they know they need a savior, and they know they need grace more than others. And so that really did strike me, Bob. That really
people freak out, when the book came out and her journal and her questions in the darkness. I loved it.
Oh yeah.
I mean, what's this thing that we can't ever question God? We can't be angry at God.
Yeah.
What is that about? What kind of faith is that? I mean, it's like,
I know. I don't think it's real. You and I talked about when my friend Steve Case, we flew down in his plane to spend a day with Billy Graham, when Billy Graham turned 90. And that was another one of those moments where I'm sitting there, and Steve allowed me to have this conversation. I'd met Graham a couple times at the White House and other things, but I was just asking him all kinds of questions. I was being like you, Bob, and probing really deeply. And we went on, and then at the end, he said, Doug, you've asked me a lot of questions. Could I ask you one? And I'm like, oh my gosh, you're Billy Graham. You're asking me a question. And I said, sure, Dr. Graham. And at that point, he's 90. He was wondering, everybody wanted to come down, do a big special about it, but he was on a walker, much diminished. And he said, do you think people should remember me as the firebrand of old? Or should they see me in this diminished state where I can hardly walk and I'm old and feeble? And I paused and shot up a little prayer, and then I immediately thought of Pope John Paul, who had a stroke, and he would drool and be paralyzed, but he kept going around the world. And I said, Dr. Graham, my 2 cents, and I say this very humbly, is we're in a world of celebrity and beauty that celebrates youth. I think we need to see that it's good and okay for people to age, for them to be in a weakened state. God uses that, as Paul talked about. In my weakness, I find strength. So he was kind enough to engage in this kind of conversation, but that's the humility of the man. And I left saying, most people, as they get older, they get more rigid. He was asking questions. He was probing. And as you said, Bob, he was very authentic and very introspective in the best sense. He wasn't riding on his past laurels. He was curious.
Still growing. So let's get to the book. We're already in the book, but you have 8 principles of how you rethink success. Now, I'm curious, have you lived by these principles your whole life? Is this your philosophy of life? I'm just curious how you came up with the 8. Were there?
Well, Bob, I started thinking about, these are things that have kind of ruminated in my mind. They keep, I guess I'd say simply this: the ingredients to the stew of meaning are knowable. A lot of times we say, oh, how do I find purpose and meaning? They're really knowable, but you have to really focus on them. And one of the principles about risk-taking or forgiving and things, everybody can know that. We've probably all read it in the scriptures and all these things, but a lot of time to really incorporate them in and be serious about it and think about it. And, every one of those principles, they are proven they're not only scripturally sound, but they also are proven in science and neurology and things. You take risk, for example. If you ask most people on their deathbed, what would they have done differently? Most of them would say, I wish I'd taken more risk. And we know that to be the case. When you stop risking, you start dying. When you start, it's almost like playing a game to not get hurt. You're going to get hurt. But instead, if you're like this woman, and you all can Google this, and there's a 98-year-old woman who's the oldest yoga teacher in America, in Connecticut. She took up ballroom dancing at 88. I'm like, are you kidding me?
Yeah.
But you hear this woman talk about her life and how she envisions it. I mean, she's always thinking about the present and how she can grow and develop. So I think these principles, Bob, have come to me because I've seen how viable they are in my life. And I'm always looking for the ingredients in people. I ask them, Aristotle talked about a life of thriving. And you look at somebody whose life's working, you say, why is it working? Why are they joyful? Well, they're typically forgiving people. They're hopeful people. They're givers, not takers. They still take risks. All these things, you really, as you ask people, like you and I are almost insanely curious, we're always asking people these, and I think they're repeated over and over again. So I just wanted to distill them and say, look, these are knowable things, and you need to rethink things because the culture is saying to you, this is success. Here's the metric: fame, fortune, notoriety. It doesn't deliver. What delivers is meaning on a much more profound basis.
You talk about knowing your own story, and I like that. It's as if life has a theme. When I was a young man, somebody challenged me to look at Abraham, and they said, Bob, there's a difference in a dream and a life call. A dream is something you can do real quick, but Abraham, it took his entire life to do it. And he said, think about your theme. You're the first person dealing with success I've ever seen write about know your story. I like that. Is there a storyline in your life?
Number one, it really crystallized about 8 years ago. I was with Warren Buffett's son, Peter, and he said this to me: we're all born into someone else's story. And I thought about that yes. And he said, here's my story. I'm at Stanford. I'm a sophomore. The only reason I got in was because of my last name. And I'm sitting there doing economics and finance. I hate it. And then my father famously announces he isn't leaving anything to the 3 kids. He said that wasn't a great day. And then, but then about 3 months later, my mother calls and says, Peter, your grandfather died, left you $92,000. That day, he packed his car from Palo Alto, started driving to New York, and pursued who he was and who he would become, which is a musician. And he had to differentiate himself. My observation is so many of us are living someone else's story. Our father's view of success, our mother's view of beauty, our parents' view of what a good relationship is. We have all these expectations. It's not our story. So I think, number one, we have to look hard at that story, because we're going to see a lot of the drivers in our life. And we're going to see some of these, and to get into the biblical notion, in addition to that story thing, most men particularly have never gotten the blessing where an elder says, you have what it takes, son. So they strive their whole life, and on their deathbed, they never feel like there's enough. I had this New Yorker cartoon where a guy's on his deathbed. He's hooked up to the IV, and people are huddled around him, and he says this, I should have bought more crap. Of course, that's not going to be the truth. But in a sense, that's where this life inevitably leads. So let me just tell you what I discovered, and it was relatively new, my discovery about my story. So I always wondered, why have my whole life from high school on, I've tried to bring people together to talk about things that matter in a non-judgmental way. I've always done that, Bob. And it was interesting. I started thinking about my father, who grew up in a small town in Mississippi. His mother was an evangelical, went to the small church there. There's about 1,000 people in town. He went, but he was a curious sort, and he would ask questions, which in that era were not terribly welcome, to be honest. Yeah. So he would ask question after question, and finally he realized this was not probably a good, safe place for him. So he withdrew. And I always doubted this, but he called himself his whole life an atheist. So I basically grew up in a family where, we didn't go to church. We didn't go have any religious practice. But my father was always curious. He was the first one to introduce me to Socrates' famous statement, about the curious life, about the unexamined life is not worth living. So, but I came to faith when I was 17, and that was troubling for him a little bit. He just didn't understand. So what I'd say, how has this affected me? One, Bob, I feel like I bring my father's curiosity and cynical eye to the table. I'm not buying it all the time. When somebody just says it, I want to know. Good. And the other is, I feel like I still have this childlike faith. But the other thing is, my whole life has been, whether I've been at the White House or State Department or Goldman Sachs, trying to create a safe atmosphere where people can explore and feel like it's okay to be, as C.S. Lewis called it, a seeker.
Yeah, that's good. Let me ask you about friendships, because you said genuine friendships, and then in the whole chapter you deal with peers, but you also deal with mentors and people that speak into your life. Sharing, I've probably had about 6 men speak into my life, and only one was a pastor. Leighton Ford had a small.
Oh yeah, I knew Leighton. He's great.
So he had a small group of us. He got together, and he gave us each a mentor. Well, I was really upset because he gave me a mentor that was a businessman. I mean, everybody had preachers and ministry. He gave me a business guy, and it was a white dude who sold Afro Sheen to the military. And I thought, what is this about? But that guy, I had the best mentor, because he came at it not from another preacher angle that I would understand what he was saying. I mean, he was using terms like ROI and what's Roy? What is this?
That's fantastic.
But it spoke into my life. I mean, look at you. You're like a polymath. I mean, you have all these different interests. And do you have multiple kinds of mentors, or is it just one kind?
No, I feel like I've been curious and have sought out different people. I think once you're not, and again, it goes back to my story because I wasn't threatened by ideas or challenging things. So as an evangelical, some people challenged me and said, why would you go to Princeton Seminary? Because I don't want to just have everything reinforced. I want to be challenged. So my whole life has been this journey. So I would take art classes. I would write poetry. I would go places that were unusual because I just felt like I was so secure in my faith and comfortable there that I felt like that's what I'm supposed to do, is go out in the world and just take it in, because I don't need, it's up to God what he does with these people. So I have felt like I've had this feast in life of ideas and experiences, and it's been so rich. So I've had about 7 mentors: a federal judge, Doug Coe, you and I talked about it, Chuck Reinhold, who led me to Christ, my young life leader, a number of business people, a guy, Jeff Wazzie at Goldman Sachs, Gene Fife at Goldman. I've had different ones, and mentors have been so important. Dr. Donald Drew, who I met at Labrie Fellowship through Francis Schaeffer and with Os Guinness. So these people have been on the journey my whole life. Donald Drew never married. He died at 91. He was an English literature scholar from Cambridge, and we forgave him. We had the Oxford-Cambridge rivalry. But he'd spend a month with us every year, and I would just hang out with him. He was about 25 years older, just talking about life and what really mattered. And so I feel like these mentors are really important. My worry for the next generation, with technology and with also the fact that people don't stay in jobs that long, that they don't have people who are investing in the same way. And you probably feel the same way, Bob. I don't know why these people invested in me, but they did. And I feel like now, I had a young man who played on the golf team with my son at the University of Maryland. And he emailed me last week, and it was so dear. He said, I've gone into business, Doug, and I haven't connected with you since your son and I were playing golf in Maryland, but I'm desperately in search of a mentor. Can you connect with somebody? It was just such a cry of the heart. And I connected to a great guy in Baltimore, because this guy lives in Annapolis, and they're really connecting. But I don't see that much, Bob. I must say, and I think it's a product of the craziness of our times, even before the.
But I think we're so
coronavirus.
We don't know how to learn from people outside.
Yeah.
The thing, I was reading your book. You worked with Reagan. Strong conservative credentials. And here you are, you meet with President Obama. I mean, you just messed up. They're never going to have you on Fox News now. Why did you just put? But I thought, wow. So what is it about that you can walk on different sides of the aisle, that you can? I mean, you talked about in the Reagan administration how y'all made that a priority for legislation. How many wins can you get?
Yeah. Well, and when I was on the White House staff, I can't imagine somebody doing that now, but Bill Nelson, who was in the Senate, Rick Scott defeated him from Florida, but he's a believer, and he was a congressman at the time. But he and I, during the Ethiopian famine, a place that I've spent a lot of time in, we got a whole plane, took out all the seats, filled it with grain, bags of grain. Because the communists controlled Ethiopia, we went to the north where the famine was, and we wanted to deliver directly to the NGOs this grain. And I remember telling Jim Baker, my boss, he was chief of staff, and he kind of said, just don't get killed or kidnapped. But nobody ever said to me, I can't believe you're doing that with a Democrat. They just said, wow, that's a great thing you're doing. Wow. And we had a fabulous experience. We slept on the grain going over there. We prayed together. We talked. And then it was very spontaneous. I said to Bill Nelson, I said, Bill, since we're here, let's go down and let's talk to the foreign minister. And he's a hard-ribbed communist, but let's do that. Didn't get any permission. You couldn't get away with this in a million years now. But we flew down to Addis Ababa, sat with him, and he argued a little bit like his orthodoxy of communism. I took off my ring, Bob, which has the Lion of Judah from Ethiopia, and on the top of the lion is the cross. So I handed it to him and said, "What's different about your crest now and this one?" He said, "Well, we took the cross off that." And I said, "You're the oldest Christianized nation in the world," going back to the Ethiopian eunuch. And I said, "When you did that, you've denied the transcendent, and this model flat is not going to work." So, you never know where these conversations go. And I feel like Bill Nelson and I modeling out a different way to be civil. Now, on policy matters, Bill and I disagreed. I feel like the concern I have today, Bob, people are so afraid to be even seen with somebody that's different than them. And I think, you look at Jesus as a model. He was with the publicans, the tax collectors, the prostitutes. I mean, if you're looking to create an image, he was not the image that you'd want to project. But that's how we should, I believe, how we should live. We will be confusing to people, I think.
It's interesting to me. It's interesting to me. The Democrats have one Jesus and the Republicans have another Jesus. And they each have parts of the gospel.
Yeah, exactly.
Both sides. Hey guys.
Yeah.
It's all Jesus.
Yeah.
Sorry.
Yeah.
I mean, the same one that said this also said that. Gratitude. You talk about living a life of gratitude, Doug. That's a big deal. This whole thing about gratitude, I think it's a choice you make.
Yeah, I agree. It's funny. A book that's really influenced me is Man's Search for Meaning by Viktor Frankl.
Love that book.
Where he's a psychotherapist. He's in the death camps, and he realizes the people that survive are not the physically robust, but the people that had an inner meaning, something they were living for. Well, how do you get that inner meaning? I think a part of it, neurologists say gratitude changes your brain.
Wow.
And I say to my class, I teach this MBA course at Georgetown on meaning and purpose. And I say to them, I said, you don't have to make a list of the bad things that are going on in your life. You know what they are all the time. But you have to every day create the space to really think about the small things that are glorious, the big things you have to be grateful for. So I write them down, Bob. I shoot for every day to write down 3 to 5, just short. That might be dark roast, Italian coffee. It doesn't have to be anything grand. At the end of the year, I'll have about 900 little things. And I write them on one sheet of paper, just little things, front and back of one sheet, and then I laminate it. So I have every year this laminated thing just to keep it around, and just all these blessings and things for which I'm grateful. But I do think it changes your outlook. It makes you a better person. I think people are attracted to people that are grateful. And people that are always complaining, negative. I mean, we all have reasons. Things aren't exactly how any of us would want them.
You also talk about how that if you're going to really be successful in life, you're going to have to learn to forgive, and you're going to have to serve. And have you ever had to forgive somebody that was really hard to forgive? I mean, we can forgive our kids or somebody we're close to.
No, that's a great point, Bob. I would start with on the premise that some of us have an easier time forgiving because of the story we were born into.
Right.
Some of us have grown up in very negative, judgmental families where it's never over that you saw grievance, you saw Uncle Harry, I will never forgive him because he didn't show up for my son's wedding or whatever it is. And you have this grievance culture. So I think, number one, you have to understand the story you're born into, because some of us have an easier time forgiving. Mm-hmm. But others of us, there's always going to be testing points where we're betrayed, where we're hurt. And I think this is where it's the real thing. You got to decide whether you take the gospel seriously or not. It's easy to forgive as Jesus said, forgive people that forgive you. The hard ones are the ones that are just horrible and are mean to you and betray you regularly. My model is looking at Jesus on the cross when he looks down at those Roman soldiers and others and says, Father, forgive them, for they know not what they do. Everybody says, oh, I would forgive if they just came to me. We've got to forgive even when they don't come to us. I tell my class, not forgiving is like me drinking poison and expecting you to die. It just is stupid and it's destructive and it just flat doesn't work. I say to people, get over it. Find a way to forgive, and when we had our Path North meeting, Bob, in Charleston 3 years ago, I surprised them the last morning. We were there. The lights went out. We had about 200 leaders. We had a clip, an ABC clip that talked about Mother Emanuel Church. There had been, the Dylan Roof had killed 9 people, had gone into the church. Next clip, you have these parishioners standing in front of him at the sentencing, unchoreographed, forgiving him. You took something precious away, but if God forgives you, I forgive you. Next, the lights come up. This attractive African-American man comes up, who's the new pastor of that church because the pastor had been killed. He invites us to come down. So we go down to the church and hear from parishioners about how they could forgive. And we had people in our group that were not happy with this. How do you forgive a monster like that? How can you do it? So we had this great discussion. At the end, we stood up and said to them, okay, we're going to pass out an envelope and a sheet of paper, and you sit there for 5 minutes in quiet. Who do you need to forgive? And write a letter to yourself about that. And we're going to mail it to you in 1 month. And it was powerful, Bob, really powerful. I had one guy tell me, I had one of our Path North members who's a big CEO in the South. I was at a meeting with him up in the Adirondacks. He said, I've never told you this, Doug, but I've been alienated from my mother for 20 years. I went through that exercise and I reached out to her. We're talking for the first time.
Wow. When you were writing in the book too, it moves from gratitude, forgiveness to service. And I think about that and forgiveness. You talk about Darrell Davis. Darrell is a friend of mine.
Is that? Wow, I would love to meet that guy.
You've not met him.
Story.
Oh, you got to have him come. You've got to have him come to your next gathering.
I would love that, Bob.
Do you know what?
You should bring him and interview him. I'd love that.
I'll do it and let him play. He is phenomenal.
Oh my gosh, that blew my mind about the Klan and him going around saying, "Why do you hate me?"
The reason that we're working together, you know what I do with Muslims with Imam Majid. So he does the same thing with white separatists. And so listen to this. We're at a meeting together. We're working on countering violent extremism. And it's about 40 of us that are doing this big project together. And so we're sitting around discussing, and they're talking in America. If you want to deal with this, the crazy thing is we need to let our focus, and these are all young people, many of them very liberal, but the response is we need to focus on young, white males in their 20s.
Yeah.
Think about that. When would you think about, the focus is going to be on young white males? And yet he's right in the middle of all of that because that's where the change has to take. And he's serving those people.
I'm amazed both with the work he does and you do, because that's the work we should do. It's dangerous. It's crazy. That's where it's supposed to be, is peacemakers. And a peacemaker typically gets beat up by both sides.
It's part of it. Let me ask you this. You talk about defining success and failure. In your book, you made the statement, you're quoting someone, that after $75,000, you're not really any happier.
Yeah.
Come on, man. At least 150. You read about rich guys.
Yeah, I know. It's funny. I don't know why the research seems to indicate that once you have the basics need, food, shelter, and clothing, which is about 75 for most people, if you make 90 or 100, you aren't incrementally happier. You, up to that point when you're kind of food deprived and insecure and these things, that's a different thing. But when you hit that mark, the happiness doesn't go up. And this is why so many people are so profoundly accomplished, rich, but empty. And I remember, Bob, when I was interviewing with, leaving the State Department to go up to New York, we have an investment bank, talking to the head of the investment banking division at Morgan Stanley. And this guy said, "You've had an interesting, eclectic career." And they looked at me and said, "I'm in prison. It's a really nice prison because I have everything you could want, but I'm alienated with my kids. I'm on my third marriage, and I have no friends, and I'm alone." And I thought, this is a more honest version of a successful person. But the unintended consequences of any kind of accomplishment is you can get isolated and lonely and alienated.
Yeah. Let me ask you this. You also talk about inviting risk. And in your book on page 157, I was reading this last night, and I thought, wow, this has how would you respond to this in the term of what we're dealing with right now with the pandemic? It says 157. I can't find it. I wrote the wrong page now. Oh, here it is, 162. But there are 5 things about the Case Foundation that Gene Case lists. Like, number 1 was make big bets and make history. Number 2, be bold and take risk. Number 3, make failure matter. Like, we're all going to blow it, but get back up on your feet, learn from it, do something with it.
Yeah.
Fourth, reach beyond your bubble. And 5th, let urgency conquer fear. How would you relate those to the current pandemic? Do you think they're right for what we're facing?
That's a great thing. One of the things as I've, over the years thought about these things, I was surprised to know that some people have a genetic, a gene that causes them to be greater risk takers. It's really interesting. And it's identifiable. It's really a medical thing that you could find out. But I think, Bob, one way to think about risk, there are two sides of risk. There's reckless risk, which I talk about Michael Kennedy and my interaction with him. And then there's prudent risk. And I think today there are times when you have to be prudent and careful is the right thing, and to really be more measured with this. I think, and I'm not advocating just do crazy things with your life. I'm saying extend yourself. For some of us, the risk might be to say, I hate the idea of being quarantined, but I'm in my 70s. I'm going to risk it and do the exact opposite of what I want to do. So risk might look different for all of us. It might be incremental. I remember, Secretary Dalton, who the former Secretary of the Navy, he challenged me, when you go up to a homeless person, just don't give them some money. Ask them their name, ask them their story. That's a form of risk. It gets you into a different kind of conversation. And it's more dangerous to get into the mess of somebody's life. So I think risk really changes us. I think, when you look at Jesus, he was a risk taker, but he was not trying to destroy everything. He was trying to fulfill the law and do all these kind of things. So I would just say today, be careful, and I'd say, who is that audience? And I talk a lot in there about that. The Quakers had this great idea, because the Hasidic Jews have the culture that helps define a lot of them. The Mormons have that. We evangelicals can have all these shoulds and pressures to be the certain type. But it's really interesting. The Quakers had this great line. They said, live to please an audience of one. So I'd say to myself, to the audience, I'd say, what does that look like for me, Doug Holladay, to try to live to please the audience of one? That's going to look liberal sometimes. That's going to look like I'm going to quarantine sometimes. Sometimes it's going to mean when that guy's broken down on the side, even though we're quarantining, he doesn't have a mask on, I'll stop and help him. So it's the risk is going to look differently. It goes back to that simple premise. Who are we living to please?
That's good. I like that. You talk about an integrated life. And in an integrated life, it's seeing the whole. Talk to us a little bit about that. You mentioned in an integrated life, you talk a lot about Walter Isaacson talking about Da Vinci. I read that biography, incredible biography.
Yeah.
But he could see the whole.
Yeah. And so many could, you look at Mozart and these people, they were believers, and they decided they just didn't talk about the Bible all the time. They created great music to the glory of God. Well, my view is always, I remember going on a retreat in my 20s because I kept reading. The more I read the Bible, I said, we need to be about empowering people to live a life of faith in the marketplace. So I had this group of men, 100 men. They're all businessmen, dentists, doctors, and all. So I gave them all a sheet of paper. I wrote a line down, and I said, write secular on one column and spiritual on the other. And I said, I want you to divide up your life, the spiritual things, the secular things. So we got back, and I'm up there, we're writing them down. They said, spiritual is praying, going to church, leading someone to Christ. Secular is my job, it's mowing the lawn, it's all those things. And then I looked at them and said, okay, I've set you up here. How does it feel to know what you did was totally unbiblical? And then I wrote Colossians 3:17 says, and whatever you do in word or deed, do all in the name of the Lord Christ, giving thanks to God the Father through him. So to me, the holistic life, this is why the Hebrews in the Old Testament, we have the dietary laws and all. What we eat, what we think, where we work, everything is a high calling. So I say to people, I would like, it's as biblical to sell an insurance policy as to lead someone to Christ. I know that's controversial, but when we get that, how different the world would be. Because everything is a holy enterprise.
But I think you're right, Doug. And so you teach at Georgetown, but I'll give you a little assignment. If you may have read this, but I have pastors read Colossians 1:15 through 20.
Mm-hmm.
One of the most profound passages.
I love it. Yeah.
6 times he talks about the reconciliation of all things. And
yeah.
We've been raised in the church with this idea that all I need to do is get people saved, and Jesus is coming back, and the world is going to hell, and there's going to be judgment and this horrible battle.
Yeah.
We miss the whole point. It's about the reconciliation.
I totally agree, Bob.
I used to see people as fallen, depraved, and yeah, we're fallen and depraved, but guess what? Every person I see now, I see is created in the image of God. That's biblical too. So,
I love that. We're all broken. That's why I talk about, we all have this dark side and this shadow side. And some of us just hadn't been found out yet, but we're all like, I love Henry Nouwen's book called The Wounded Healer. I don't think the book's that great, but the title's terrific. We're all wounded and we're all healers,
Yeah.
And we're all, to some extent, really lost, and that's okay. But I think as Christians, we have to get really comfortable with the idea that we're the one beggar telling another beggar where bread is available, and that's a humility, and that's and we learning from others, taking from even non-believers, letting them give us the gift of their friendship or their help or whatever. I just think there's so much there when we live this life, inviting God to show up in all kinds of different guises and in different ways. I think that's amazing. So, one of the stories that gets me, Bob, in the book of Acts, and I think how amazing when Paul shows up in the Acropolis. Now, can you imagine if you're an evangelical doing what he did? So they had 13 gods in the Athenian culture. sex, harvest, all these kind of things. But they had the 13th one, which was to an unknown God in case they missed somebody, missed one. So he gets out there. Athens was the epicenter of ideas. He gets up there and he affirms them. Now think about this. These are not Christians. These are not Jews. These are, secular people, that philosophers. He said, I want to affirm you. You're obviously a religious people by virtue of having all these gods you worship. And then he used his creativity. He said, let me tell you about that unknown God you worship, but you don't know who he is. Is that unbelievable? That's like going to a group of Mormons or Hasidic Jews and say, I am so impressed, you Mormons, what you do with the family, what you do, just affirming them because it's true. Yeah. But then say, let me add another piece to the conversation. Would that be okay?
I love that. But see, you're learning from one another. Imam Rajid taught me something I never realized. Did you know Jesus never ate pork?
Oh, okay.
I never thought about it.
Yeah, that's probably right.
Orthodox Jew.
Yeah.
And I told him, I said, well, that's great, but you do know.
But you're in Texas. You love barbecue.
I know. That's right. That's right. So I said, okay, I'll quit eating pork. But the next part is Jesus' first miracle. He turned the water into wine.
Yeah.
If Majid was a Christian, he'd be a Baptist because his next statement was, but it was grape juice. It wasn't wine.
Yeah.
I was raised my whole life with that. Hey, this has been fun. I love this, Doug. I want to get you to do something. Your last thing is on legacy. This is a phenomenal book. I mean,
thank you, Bob. I really appreciate
everybody
it.
To grab it. But you and I both like Dietrich Bonhoeffer. And for years, I had this little poem stuck in the wall beside my desk. And I love it. I was told it was actually on the wall of his prison. I don't know if that's true or not.
Wow.
But I love this poem. Bonhoeffer, who am I? And you think about legacy you're leaving behind. And he's coming to the end of his life.
Yeah.
He's still asking questions. I love this. He's like Billy Graham. How should I come across?
Yeah. And he was just, yes, absolutely, Bob. I mean, what a guy. He was hung in Flossburg, this prison, because he was in on this is a challenge. Here's a believer that conspired to assassinate Adolf Hitler. I mean, that's amazing. But he gets caught, and 3 weeks before the Allies liberated Germany, he was hung at Flossenburg. And he wrote this.
Have you been to that prison?
I have not. Have you?
No, but if you watch the movie A Hidden Life that just came out with Terrence Malick, you need to have him come speak at one of your things. It's at that prison.
Oh, really?
Yeah, so Terrence Malick takes the concepts of the kingdom of God. He's a modern day movie maker. He's an older guy from Waco. But you've got to see it, A Hidden Life by Terrence Malick, the principles of the kingdom of God seen through this farmer who refused to fight in it. But he goes to the same prison that Bonhoeffer does. And my understanding is they filmed it there. At that.
Oh, my word.
Yeah, you got to see it. Go ahead. I'm sorry.
So Bob wanted me to read this, so I'll just read this is part of the poem. It's called Who Am I? So he talks about how he was so kind to his jailers, and others thought, wow, what a person. But he knew his dark side. He knew there was another side of himself. And he said, am I really what others tell me, or am I only what I myself know of me? Who am I? This or the other? Am I then this today and the other tomorrow? Am I both at the same time, in public a hypocrite, and by myself a contemptible, whining weakling? Then he closes it up by saying, who knows? But I know one thing, God has made me for himself, and he knows me. Who am I?
I love that. Ambassador Doug Holladay, Rethinking Success. Get it? Let some of your guys and gals read it together as groups. It's an incredible book. It'll sharpen you. It'll grow you. get it.
Thank you, Bob. And what an honor to be with you. You're one of my heroes. You are living the life the way I would want to live it.
Thanks, Doug. You too.